Hi, welcome to the 9 to 5 podcast. I'm Elliot.
And I'm Josh, and today our topic is how to talk to friends about FI.
Imagine trying to explain to your friends that you want to retire decades earlier than they ever thought possible. Let's figure out how to keep this light and friendly.
Yeah, so Elliot, a few years ago, I was going to my first economy, and I was telling a guy that I work with, I was trying to explain to him where I was going for the weekend. I was going on this conference, and he kept asking more questions, and I didn't really know how to explain that I was going to this financial independence retreat. And I just said it's money conversations. It's a lot of personal finance conversations. And he kind of turned his head and he looked at me funny and he raised his eyebrows and he said, "You got to be careful about those kind of people." So clearly he had no idea where I was going.
Well, why do you think it is so tricky to talk about fire with people who aren't on the path?
I think it's just money in general is a taboo topic and people still struggle with that. They still struggle with divulging information, and maybe it's for the fear of feeling judged or that they're insecure with their own personal situation. But I think that is where it originates, is that just in society as a whole, we don't really talk about money very much. What do you?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The old adage of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I think out of those three, money really is maybe even the final frontier that people really don't want to talk about. It is that private to people, and people just realize how ingrained in our culture that is to not really talk about. And so while it may seem so foreign to your coworker at the time, honestly, we're the countercultural
Yeah,
ones, right?
for sure. Yeah, and it's one of those things that probably is ingrained in people from a young age because they don't hear the information from their parents, and they just kind of grow up in a culture where it's not something that people talk about. I remember one time I must have been 18 or 19 years old, and I was talking to a friend of a friend. We both worked for grocery stores, and they were different grocery chains. And I remember saying, "Well, I just got a raise. I'm in a union, and I acquired this many hours, and I got the next bump." And he had been with the grocery store chain that he was with for a few years longer than me. And I was just curious. I remember just flat out asking him, like, "What are you up to? What's your hourly rate?" Thinking that as an 18-year-old, I wouldn't imagine that somebody would be
Right.
very, they generally be comfortable telling you. He just flat out said, "I don't talk about finances." And I remember that it's always stuck with me all these years later. I thought it was so odd that somebody was that that close to kept that information so close to them. But that's just kind of, I think, how most people are.
Yeah, I think you're right. Is truly, I mean, we both talked about it in our origin stories about how that's not really something that we talked about in our own households. But the story that you just brought up of talking about your salary for your young job where it's not your career, the last time that I had that true transparency with a large swath of friends or things of that nature would be when I was still in college and getting ready for that first job. It was kind of a badge of honor when you're applying to different jobs. Living in fraternity house, we had lots of other people that were in similar positions, and people would sometimes paste their offer letters next to their door to say, "Hey, look at me, I got a job offer." It was just excitement that, hey, I'm somebody has validated me and is going to give me that job, right?
Yeah, so it was a signal that you were moving on or able to move on to the next step in life, it sounds like. And it wasn't competitive.
No. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's probably part of it is while that may have been true, I know that that's true that some people in my house certainly were probably vying for the same jobs and things of that
Hmm.
nature. Like it wasn't mean spirited. We all wanted each other to succeed. And I think, the old saying, there's enough money to go around in the world that we don't need to feel so competitive that it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So
And
celebrating each other's successes.
sure. And the more that I feel like we can talk more openly about it, not only because I think there is probably some of that pride that's built into where people feel like they're working hard and they either need to show their worth by having things and stuff and presenting themselves as successful. And then there is probably the flip side of it where we look at some of that as, well, that's an overindulgence and maybe you're taking away from your future, but that's how people will want to present themselves into the world so that they can show that they're not willing to talk about how much they're making or saving, but they can show you their new car that they just purchased or the vacation that they just took or the house they just upgraded to or whatever.
What you're saying is just really that signaling of how well you're doing in life is in American culture is really shown by the goods and services and things that we acquire and we show
Mm-hmm.
externally, right? That Instagram lifestyle of, hey, look how successful I am because I took this vacation or I stayed in this hotel or I bought this car or I wear these
Mm-hmm.
clothes, etc., is really that consumerist society of trying to show, yeah, hey, if you're doing well in the world, this is how your life looks,
Yeah.
right?
Ironically, most of the time you're not seeing the information that's behind the scenes, such as how much money were they able to save or contribute to their future or to any number of things that are going on from a actual personal finance standpoint. You're only seeing the result of potentially debt,
Sure.
contributing the max to their 401k and maxing out their Roth IRA,
Yeah,
the things.
absolutely. I mean, there's no button to say, like, hey, I have maxed out my 401k this year. Look at me. I'm setting up my future self for
Right,
success, right? And so, I mean, I think that is one of the reasons why this movement is so countercultural is there is no way to say, look at me, I'm doing the right thing and I'm spending my money on what's important to me is actually my time freedom,
right.
right? So next, why do you think money talk, especially fire, is such a touchy subject with some of our friends?
For me, I think they're maybe a little bit intimidated by it. I mean, even I think about my own past experience that whenever I was in my 20s, I didn't have a clue about investing or savings or thinking about the future. I was just living in the here and now. And I think a lot of people are of that mindset. And until they're ready to really face what the future might hold, their current situation is, let me just get through today. Let me get through this week, this month, whatever it might be. And investing stuff is intimidating and scary. And so let's maybe kind of ignore it and hope that it just works out.
Yeah, of course. I mean, pull the best ostrich impersonation and just bury our heads in the sand and
Mm-hmm.
just hope by the time we pull our heads out, it'll be all rosy,
Yep.
right? But I think you've hit the nail on the head again is, when I've approached some people talking about the fire movement, you may get the "you're crazy" reaction, or like, there's no way that I could spend, if I say that I save 50% of my income, most people's eyes are 10 times the size of their head at that point, right? Is there's no way that I can save 50%. And the norm, the story of how I'm doing well in saving for a retirement is maybe 10% of my total take
Mm-hmm.
home pay. I'm doing great if I'm saving
Mm-hmm.
10%.
I agree with you. I think that I was of that mindset for a while, as I probably mentioned in my origin story, where I I was taken by one of my supervisors early on to HR, and we talked through what a 401k is and how to set that up. And even at the time, I was like, yeah, that sounds nice, but I'm not really interested in that right now. And I lost all those early years, probably the first 5 years or so, of investing. I just didn't contribute anything to my 401k. I didn't even contribute enough to get the match. So I do think that there is a lot of that still out there, and hopefully these kinds of conversations, if people will find these kinds of conversations, they can be helpful. But we should, as a culture, as a society, be more open and talk about this stuff more than what we have been.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to know that there are increasingly more protections in place to kind of save people from themselves, so to speak. But I think there is really these generations that were really on the onset of switching from defined benefit or pension plans to defined contribution or 401k and similar self retirement plans, and how in my own opinion, I think these people really got kind of the raw end of the deal because they didn't, you know, it sounds great to a company, right? Is no longer do I have to force savings and management on my own side to pay out different benefits. I can just say, "Oh, hey, I'm going to give you extra incentive to make sure you do the right thing." But you look at the everyday American, there's no way that you're setting those people up for success. So while it's good that changes are being made, I think there was a large gap there that a lot of people are in just such a terrible hole.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. When you tell people about FIRE, financial independence, retire early, what kind of reactions do you usually see?
Yeah, I mean, I think you usually run into a couple different monikers for each of the different types of people that you may run into. So, first, maybe you had the skeptics, right? They would say, there's no way that that's possible. Like, I'm sure for your own self that you probably ran into some of these people when you announced retirement at your
Oh
own
yeah,
company.
for sure.
Is that true?
And I'll go back further. I remember a conversation that I had with my aunt, someone in my family years ago. This was probably 20 years ago. And it was around the time that my uncle had retired. So he would have been, I think he was normal retirement age, 65, 63, something like that. And I remember, no, I apologize. He was probably a little bit younger than that. He was probably in his late 50s when he retired. And I remember asking her at the time, or telling her that I would like to retire when I'm young. But I had no idea or concept of FIRE at the time. I just knew that I didn't want to work until I was 65. So he had finished a little bit earlier, and I knew that I wanted to do the same. And she said, "Oh, you'll never be able to. Things are
Yeah, clearly.
the world, and there's a lot of negative mindset in the world that things are just getting worse and worse and worse, and there's so much doom and gloom, and that they're generationally, the current generation has it worse than past generations. And of course there's flip sides of
Sure.
that, but back to your point on in my own experience, whenever I made the announcement and word started to spread, people were very skeptical. Like, how did you do this? What are you really? Are you how is this possible? You're way too young. You're way too young to do this.
Yeah, I mean, the projection is real, right? Is people put themselves in your own shoes and like, yeah, there's no way I could
Hmm.
retire. And once again, that it's so foreign of a concept to people not in the movement that it does seem like it's impossible or it's got to be a scam or Josh got paid, some ungodly amount because he must have won the lottery or had a massive
Hmm.
inheritance or any number of things, right? That makes other people introspectively think, well, how in the world was Josh able to do it? And I must be doing something wrong if I can't do it.
And I think that some people will be skeptical from this, but they don't really look at their own lifestyle compared to somebody else's lifestyle either. Where I remember telling someone as they were curious about it at the time, and I was explaining kind of the situation that I had been in and how I had paid off debt. I didn't have a mortgage and all the things that we chose to do to make our our living expenses as low as they could be. And they said, they kind of turned right around and said, well, my spouse wanted to do this major renovation to our house. So we took out this second mortgage so that we could put in this addition and do all these things, and it was very, very expensive. It was like a couple
Sure.
$100,000. And I know that they didn't make much more than I did, but it was a choice that they were making for their family and their life. But it was a choice that clearly was going to cost them many more years because it was all debt and there was a second mortgage and all these things. But at the same time, they weren't looking at it from the perspective of maybe I could have done something a little bit differently here and potentially set myself up for a future that involved a few less working years.
Sure. Yeah. What sounds sexier, right? A brand new addition to my house that I can show all my neighbors and talk to my coworkers, or paying down debt so that ultimately you don't have to work years into your
Mm-hmm.
career. Persona of people that I run into when I tell people about the fire community is the Joker, right? Somebody that incessantly just teases you about, you're just cheap ass, right? Or something along those lines is, you must be eating rice and beans, or you must not go on vacations, or pinch a penny every spot you can find.
I think we can do an entire episode on this topic because there is that fine line between frugal and cheap. But I think there's maybe even a third leg to that stool where it's just being intentional with your spending. And I definitely have had experiences of falling into all three of those camps. But I definitely have had the privilege of being the butt of the jokes whenever it's just like certain things that I choose not to spend my money on. And my truck is 13, 14 years old at this point. People will tease me about that. Why do you have a small truck? Why is your truck so old? Why does your truck have so many miles on it? All those things.
Right.
And so
Yes, of course.
I think of it as I'm maximizing the efficiency of a vehicle that's still totally fine, and I don't have any need or desire to get something new or flashy or sexy, like you said earlier. And they look at it like I'm being cheap.
Yeah, of course. He's got to be cheap so he can retire. I mean, that's the only way that it's possible,
That's
clearly.
right.
So, yeah, I think you're right. It is totally worth having a whole episode to dive into that. Have you run into any of these people
I
before?
feel like those are the most common in my experience of people that have found out that I retired early and they're like, "Oh, good for you," which is totally fair feedback. I don't necessarily like to talk about myself or want to get into all the details, especially if it's somebody that I don't know very well. But they just, yeah, that's nice.
So, do you think that it is purely dismissive, or do you think they're happy for you, but they're just completely non interested? Or is it something along the lines of, how many people say that when they're having a conversation with somebody, they're already thinking about the next thing that they're going to say, and they're not really actively listening to you?
Yeah,
Do you think there's some component of
it
that?
could be. I generally think it's probably the former though, the where they're just generally not, it's not for them. They have not necessarily had the thought of, hey, I could potentially retire earlier or I could do something different, whether it's in their career or maybe working less or whatever their circumstances might be. Like that, those kind of thoughts haven't necessarily entered their mind
Mhm.
as actively maybe as they have in your mind. So they're just like, oh, well, cool, that's great, but not really that interested in that for themselves.
Fair. The final one that I have is the curious friend. Have you run into many of these people about where they start to ask those genuine questions about, how did you get started? More information about the FI community.
Yeah, far fewer than I expected. I was thinking that I would get a lot more interest from people, but there's only been a handful that initially seemed to be more curious and asked questions and wanted to understand my story. But then shortly after, I feel like maybe some of those conversations led to additional conversations, but Aside from you, Elliot, there's probably no other person that I'm having these active conversations with on a regular basis, other than my wife, about money. There have been some conversations where I feel like that I have at least laid the groundwork and caused people to maybe think a little bit differently about their current situation. And I remember in just one example where I was having a conversation with a friend where he was complaining about his truck. He'd had it in the shop again and had some work being done to it, and it was costing him like $1,000 or whatever it was. It was not cheap, but not outrageous. It wasn't a dramatic, catastrophic failure of something. It was just needed a repair. And the cost of repairs is high on just about anything. So he was saying, I think I want to buy a new truck. And I just kind of went through the exercise of thinking through how many repairs have you had on it in the last, let's say, 3 years. And he thought about that for a minute, and he had a couple of examples. And then I said, well, okay, you've fixed these things. What do you think could go wrong with it in the future? And he didn't have as clear of an idea of what that could be, but I kind of described, okay, maybe it's another $1,000 next year. Maybe it's $1,500 the year after that. But if you were to buy a new truck, which would be nice, but you're potentially spending $500-$600 every month on that. With a used, continuing to drive your used truck, you have those costs of maintenance, and they may be unexpected, but you can kind of estimate that maybe you'll spend $1,000, $1,500 a year on it. And he thought about that for a while, and actually then a couple days later, I got a message from his wife where she was like, hey, he really listened to what you had to say about the advice on that, and he decided not to get a new truck. So thanks for talking him through that. He hadn't thought about it from that perspective before.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, when you think about how much better that somebody probably is by just having that moment of contemplation, it's something that certainly we talk about in the FI community a decent amount is before we actually purchase, kind of having that intentionality and saying, give it that 72-hour rule. Really think about, is this just an impulse, or come back a couple of days later and see, is this something that I really care about? And yes, I'm ready to make that purchase.
Yeah, and just running the numbers. If you just put some framework around what you think that the cost is going to be versus what the cost currently is. So using the new automobile as an example, you can kind of map that out over a period of years. Used vehicle or current vehicle versus different vehicle. And that, I think people look at it just from that perspective of, it's a $600 a month payment. I can manage that. I can figure out a way to pay that. And they don't look at it from the offset of, what if I were to save that money?
Yeah, of course. And not to mention the payment is one cost, but like Ramit talks about all the hidden costs of vehicles, and Mr. Money Mustache does the same thing. I know he's got a whole article about it.
Yeah, we could do a deep dive on vehicles too.
Yeah.
Topic conversations.
Absolutely.
How do you actually talk about fire without scaring people off?
So I think we really need to meet people where they're at, is practice that active listening and be more, that soundboard for the person to hear what are their goals, where are they today, like where do they want to be in the future. And the joke moniker of the fire movement is such a cult or whatever else, is we don't need to preach at people. We don't need to make them drink from a fire hose, is just kind of meet people where they're at, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think about a conversation that I had with a friend recently where he knew my situation, and he was telling me that he would like to retire in the next, I think within the next 5 years. So he would be in his early 50s by then. And he had a very general idea of how he could draw down on his money while his money still maintained its current value or could potentially continue to grow into the future. So he was essentially describing the 4% rule of thumb, but he didn't really have that an idea of that concept. He hadn't heard the terminology. So I shared with him just some basic information from Bill Bengen, an article, and said, "Hey, take a look at this." And he read it and he came back to me. He's like, "This is exactly what I thought in my mind that could work, but I'd never actually seen it spelled out this way. Makes perfect sense. I think I'm in good shape." He's not going to dig deep and necessarily go down the rabbit hole of all the fire information, but he has the basic framework now and an assurance that he has enough money that he could probably live on for the rest of his life and not have to worry about it.
Right. That example of you talking to that person is a great example of if you find that person that is really gung ho. I just talked to brother-in-law. He's 19, just getting into his career, and he's at such a perfect stage. Think about if you or I had found the fire movement when we were
Yeah.
19. Like we would have been done so
Yeah.
early. I mean, it's not even funny. Like we all know that the superpower of Phi is having time on your
Mm-hmm.
side. So, you know, it, with him, converse to the story that you just told, it was that he was more voracious. Was first kind of allow him to kind of dip his toe in the water and see, hey, is this something that he's actually interested in? Recommend a book. So I recommend Simple Path to Wealth. J.L. Collins obviously is the gateway for so many people, but just made that suggestion. And then he came back maybe a week and a half later, and he's like, "Oh yeah, like that book's
Oh,
great."
wow.
And I don't know how far he even got in the book, but like can tell that he had at least started
Mm-hmm.
reading it, saw the impact of it, that it could have on his life, and then we've gone on to have multiple conversations. And so that does allow you to kind of use the analogy of leading the horse to water, but you can't make it
Mm-hmm.
drink, right? Ultimately, you just gotta meet people where
Mm-hmm.
they're at.
Yeah, a
So,
lot of times it's like you mentioned earlier, it's just asking them what their goals are. I found that it's so much easier to keep the conversation going if you just ask more questions.
yeah, of course. And I would echo that sentiment. I know that you shared in your origin story how you had first found it. You had kind of the coworker that you immediately went to and it's like, look at how great this is, right? Like open your
Yeah.
eyes. But yes, we have matured, I'm sure, in our approach. But so, kind of along with that, what is your modern day fire elevator pitch?
I think that it's more of if somebody's interested, just very subtly start introducing them to things that worked for me. And that might be that I invested in real estate or that I overcame a period of time where I was living paycheck to paycheck and I just wanted to do better with money. And knowing that I wanted more freedom, so I wanted to work less. And just kind of introducing them to some of my own values. And from there, if anybody seems interested after that point, which is rare, honestly, then I can start talking about, well, there's this whole concept of financial independence. And I think once the two words together, financial independence, I think there might still be a lack of understanding of what that truly means. So, yeah, I think that I haven't really developed anything that's been easy and clear at this point. I welcome your thoughts on that.
You mean you have converted like 500 people to the five movement yourself with
No,
your perfectly crafted elevator
no,
pitch?
not even five people.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I've been watching the television show House of Lies. Are you familiar with it
No.
at all? All right. So it follows the life of Don Cheadle's character is a strategy consultant in kind of the management consulting world. And so, of course, elevator pitches and
Hmm.
being this closer and everything else. So I bring up this bizarre tangent to say I have had some success, but just like the best two words in any consultant's repertoire is it
Mm-hmm.
depends, right? Is it's not a one size fits all approach, that is this perfectly crafted elevator pitch to get people excited about the fire movement. But what I would say is trying to make it simple, digestible, and talking exactly like you said, what's worked for me. So I mean, there's lots of monikers of basically saying spend less than what you make, save it, put it into low cost index funds or other vehicles like that that earn you more money on the other side, and prioritize your spending appropriately. So those are kind of the pillars that I focus
I
on.
think sometimes that might scare people off a little bit. That when you talk about spending less than you make, and that phrasing might rub people the wrong way. At least maybe that's some of the experience that I've had where people are like, oh, I actually remember a situation where a friend was kind of mocking me in front of another friend where he said, oh yeah, he like saves his money or something ridiculous like that. That was like his exact phrasing. And and
Interesting.
so I think that maybe if we changed it a little bit to acquiring assets or acquiring some form of, well, I guess it's assets, as long as people understand what assets means. But
Yeah.
acquiring assets so that they can produce some type of income for you in the future that you can live off of, so that you no longer have the need to have a full-time job if you so choose.
Very Kiyosaki there.
That's probably where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no, I think I've never thought of it as that statement of spend less than what you earn as being off-putting, but I mean, the way that you just expressed it, yeah, I could see how that's true, right? Is you're kind of poking somebody in the eye and saying, like, you must be spending more than you actually make. And while that may be true, whether it's true or not doesn't really matter, right? Perception is reality. And, just because we're trying to say, like, that should be common sense, is like, you're never going to retire if you spend more than what you earn. You're never going to get any better if the way that you kind of learn how to be better never reaches your ears because the message is off putting.
Yeah, it has a tiny bit of judgment into it where it's saying that you're doing it wrong.
I mean, it's coming from I would say, a point of
Mm-hmm.
privilege in that, of course, I'm not saying that everybody in the FI movement is privileged by no means, but I'm saying once we get to that point, we are finally at that point of comfort that, I mean, we're all trying to make it so that money is no longer a
Mm-hmm.
concern in our life. And that is such a rare position and is a privileged
Yeah.
position.
Yeah. That's
So,
good.
yeah.
Yeah. I was
If,
mentioned that it goes into one of the next points, which is just the benefits without being preachy. And I felt that has been a challenge for me over the years because going back to our previous point about spend less than you make, and I've pointed that out to people at times, and that's definitely not the thing to do. That's people get very resentful very fast.
yeah.
What's your experience with that, or do you have any experience with that?
Yeah. I have had some success in converting. Now I do sound like I'm in a cult, but yeah, getting people excited about the five movement and changing their way of thinking. But I think that also wasn't anything necessarily that I did that got them ready for that message as much as it was they fell into that kind of persona of being that curious person that was at a point in their life that they're ready to take on something new like this. And this was just the gentle push to ultimately allow them to fall into the five movement. It wasn't like I lead this perfectly crafted argument and change somebody's mind that was a huge spender, and now all of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden they've pivoted their entire life
Yeah.
to follow this different path.
Right. Right. So we've spent a lot of time on maybe talking about what to do, what kind of things should we not be doing, and what kind of bad experiences have you had when you've tried to talk to people about this kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's right. Do you have any mistakes that you've made in these conversations?
I remember early on, whenever I found this stuff, I think we talked about in my origin story that I had a gradual introduction to the world of fire. I started out with just educating myself around money and budgeting and just trying to live within my means and then grow the gap between what we were earning and what we were spending. And then eventually after a couple of years, I stumbled upon the fire movement. And what I have found is or I guess early on, I was trying to shortcut that for everyone that I met. I was throwing them a Mr. Money Mustache article. And it was like just throwing a bomb on them. And maybe they would read one article that I would share, or I don't even know. In some cases, they may not have gotten past the first couple of paragraphs, but I usually didn't get much feedback.
Sure.
Specific situation where there was a young lady who I was working with at the time, and she was very adamant that she wanted to retire sometime in her 30s. And I was like, wow, she must be aware of the fire movement. And she wasn't. She had no clue.
Wow.
She just knew that she did not want to work for the rest of her life. And that may,
Insert the rest of the American
yeah,
economy.
exactly. And maybe she had aspirations of being a stay-at-home mom or something of that sort. But I didn't even like ask more questions. I was just like, hey, there's this whole fire movement. I've been studying personal finance for the last several years. Here's some information that you might find useful. And I shared a Mr. Money Mustache article with her. I don't even remember which one it was, but the next day, she came back with negative feedback. She was like, oh my gosh, this is not for me. This guy is a little too hardcore. And I don't even remember what else she said, but I was like, I was in shock. I could not believe it. I thought for sure she would have been like, this is amazing. This is awesome.
Yeah.
But it was quite the contrary. So you just never know what you're going to get.
There's gradients within the fire
Yeah.
movement, right? Of course, we've got on one end maybe a Mr. Money Mustache, or even more extreme, the Jacob
Mm-hmm.
Lundfisker, up to the fat fires of the world on the other side. So it is much more of a spectrum than it ever was probably when you and I
Mm-hmm.
found the movement. There were many less voices about it. But yeah, I have said Mr. Money Mustache articles just the same way that you have, and people see that he rides a bicycle. Like that,
Turn off.
this is the one total turn off. This is the only reason he was able to retire. Like, oh, he's got a blog after he retired, so he didn't actually retire later, or any number of
Mm-hmm.
things of why, once again, it's deflection and saying, oh, why this doesn't work for me and why this isn't possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that certainly is one common pitfall that we run into, right? It is not catering our message to that particular person, because like, yeah, like maybe in this example, more of a modern day, like I would say choose fi is much more kind of meet people where they're at. Personal finance's personal approach is, you can have a car, you can have whatever you want, as long as you have that intentionality. I think what Paula Pant says, you can afford
But not
anything,
everything.
but you can't afford everything. Yeah. And I think that's a very succinct message, is that level of intentionality is what you need to be successful, but prioritize the things that actually matter to
Mm-hmm.
you. Don't be overly judgmental. I can't believe that you would go buy a new $65,000 Ford F-350 or 150 at that
Right.
price. But, insert random thing that you don't believe in, but it is of importance to that person. As long as they have that level of intentionality in their life.
Yeah, I have been guilty about that and still am. I still have those judgmental moments where I look at people's situations, and maybe it's because I've heard them complain about their circumstances and that they maybe have too much stuff or have too much credit card debt or have whatever number of things that they're struggling with, and then I maybe come about, I interject my opinion instead of asking more questions. Or I've said, yeah, well, I try to be a minimalist. And it's a turnoff. Maybe they don't even want help at that point.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think another common thing that a lot of people like to say that there are no untouchables in the fire community and things of that nature, but maybe one that I think still resonates pretty hard with people is financial
Mm-hmm.
advisors, right? And how, you know, if you're getting somebody brand new into this community, going deep into these financial concepts is such a foreign thing. And so we throw around acronyms just like a financial advisor would in talking about all the different investment options and making these things sound very complex. And while we're not trying to make it difficult, it comes across as a lot. You're drinking from a fire hose. You ultimately need to help somebody walk before they can run.
Yeah, we have the best of intentions to try to help people and share all the knowledge that we've accumulated over the last decade or so. But really, if we think about our own learned experience, I mean, for myself, it was very gradual, and it was just one concept at a time. And sometimes it took a long time to really wrap my head around that concept. And I'm still learning, but it's definitely a mistake to try to expect to just share that information as much as possible with somebody in a short amount of time and have them be able to latch onto it quickly. They just typically get overwhelmed. And
I mean, 100%. Even like with people, I would say, I know that you and I are very active in our local chapter. When we have brand new people, I mean, you don't want to sit there and throw all kinds of terms at
mm-hmm.
them. You want to make sure that they understand and once again, kind of meet them where they're at. Like, I know when before I got my MBA, I didn't know what just the concept of arbitrage was. So even take it a layer further, and now I'm talking about geo arbitrage or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. It's going to be in one ear and
Yeah,
out the other for a lot of
for
people.
sure.
If you don't slow down and ask probing questions, not to be mean or rude or anything else, but just make sure that you're, once again, meeting people where they're at, is to say, hey, do you understand? Do you know what that concept is? It's not a big deal if you
Mm-hmm.
don't. I just want to make sure that I'm talking in a vernacular that is
Yeah,
appropriate.
it's a good point.
So let's see. Do you have any good lighthearted stories of any mishaps that you've had along the path of trying to conscript people into our FI mentality here?
I think I shared most of them along the way. I haven't had a ton of success being able to convert, as you called it earlier, people. I do have at least one person who's shown enough interest that I think he's going to come to one of our next local meetups. But I think that I've made so many mistakes along the way of just trying to put so much information out there. I was burned a little bit. I was more cautious that I didn't want to share too much for sake of feeling like I was going to come across as elitist, preachy. In recent experience, I did a little bit of money coaching. I think I mentioned that before. And that is so much more rewarding, and just trying to slowly over time introduce somebody to new concepts and help them out of a situation, whether that be debt or a plan for how they're going to save a certain amount of money or whatever the case might be. That is so much more rewarding and beneficial when we're sharing this knowledge and experience that we have than to try to just throw a ton of information at them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even on my own side, I would say that I've had a couple of different examples. In my old job, a bunch of developers and I used to all sit down at the table together. And this was probably real close to when I first found Mr. Money Mustache. Tried to enlist everybody. Was like, hey guys, like here's another software developer just like us who did this. You've got an outline for how you can do this. That is, here's an example. Like it seems so straightforward to me. And it is so surprising that even when you have those examples that you're like, oh, this is a slam dunk. Like you said, I probably came off as preachy or like, why aren't you doing this? Like, this is insane. I've heard the retort of, well, I like my
Mm-hmm.
work. And my common response to that is, that's totally fine. I love that you love your work. But I would also say, if you love your work, if you were being paid $0, would you come to work tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's too many people, if they're getting paid $0, are going back to work that next day for a career that they've been
Mm-hmm.
engaged in. I'm not saying that I don't enjoy my own career and things of that nature, but if I was getting paid $0, I would not be going to work tomorrow.
And of course,
You know,
just the
that's
idea of being able to create some level of margin in your life if things were to change. Because you could always say, I love my job, I love the people I work with, but those things can change in an instant. As you know, you can get a new boss next week. You can get the person you work closest with could get a promotion or move on to a different role. And suddenly your whole team's dynamics change dramatically. And then you're in a situation where, what do I do? Do I look elsewhere to find a spot where I'm going to be happier? Can I take a pay cut? Can I afford that? All those kinds of questions come into play. So it's just kind of protecting yourself for the future as well.
Yes. I mean, that's 100% true. I mean, especially in this economy right now, it's not uncommon that there are a lot of layoffs, and corporations love to talk about how we're this family, right? We all know that that's the biggest lie in the world. Like, we all have our own families.
Mm-hmm.
That's your family. But at the end of the day, it's business, and business can change and situations can change, like you just spoke about. Ultimately, you can find yourself no longer part of that family, and being prepared on the other side is what FI's all
Yep.
about. So I think that's a great spot to kind of start to wrap us up here. But maybe one question I would say that we would leave the audience with is, how have your friends reacted when you've brought up fire? Did they think you were some sort of genius, or did they just think you were a penny pincher or cheat?
Yeah. And if you have
So,
any thoughts or feedback for us, you can reach out to us.
yeah. So you can find us at 9NINE 2 TO FIPOD pod .com. So 9to5pod.com. And if you liked the episode today, like and subscribe here on YouTube or on the podcast player of your choosing. We really appreciate you tuning in today and hanging out with
Yeah.
us.
Thanks a lot, Elliot.
Thanks, Josh.
See
Talk to
ya.
you soon.